So, good evening. It has been almost 3 months ago since I made the last video, and I had some allergy problems. I have had a head cold here the last few days, but I'm feeling better tonight. So I thought I'm gonna check in here. For one is, we want to take a look tonight at the inflation situation in Russia and the Russian Federation and the causes of it, since we have a inflation issue here too in the United States. But to say this right from the get-go, the inflation issues here in the US are very different from the underlying inflation issues you have in the Russian Federation's. Totally different causes. Same outcomes, but totally unrelated in that sense. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because of my friend Svetlana made a video a few weeks ago about the inflation issues they're facing as consumers, which of course is as, probably annoying to the Russian consumer as it is to the American consumer. Then this will lead us sort of into the entire issue with the stalled out support for the Ukraine, because that is sort of interrelated in this. And as you probably know, is that the United States Congress cannot reach an agreement on how they want to go by, whether or not they're going to send more money over there or weapons or what they're going to do and how they're going to do it and all of that stuff. And that is then kind of leading us into the winter offensive by the Russian army, Russian forces, which has succeeded a little bit in some areas, but not very much, and has caused some casualties on both sides to further increase. And the numbers in general, it was like 300,000+. Lewinsky mentioned the other day. It's like I said, this is a very bloody war. I have been saying that for the last 2 years, ever since we started talking about it. And then the question is on how we really got into all of this in the first place, because all of this stuff is basically interrelated, except for the inflation in the United States. That is a completely separate story. Has to do with only with President Biden and the Democrats' agenda of clean energy and how they want to go by and do all of this stuff and all of the rebuilding America project they have and this, that, and the other thing, which is the underlying cause of that inflation. Not so much of anything else. It is really domestic, fabricated. There's some spillover in it from the money which was given out during the pandemic for the coronavirus, when we had the coronavirus lockdown and that sort of stuff. But the primary driving issue behind it is this $4 trillion package they trying to put together, partially have put together, for clean energy and saving the environment and rebuilding the roads in the American infrastructure and that sort of stuff. Is a domestic issue, and this is why that is a domestic problem, totally unrelated to anywhere else in the world. So they're going to fix it when they're going to fix it. What we're looking at here is, now let's start with the video from Svetlana. She put that up. She went to the store. She pointed out the price increases of the food. Now, I have to go back in order to understand this. Is in the 1980s, when I met Dr. Kokeyev, or Alexander, we were calling each other by our first names. He called me Peter. I called him Alexander. He explained to me in 1988, when it was still the Soviet Union and we were still pretty much at the height of the Cold War, that the money the Soviet Union was basically printing, so to speak, all went into military efforts and causes aboard the satellite wars they were fighting, especially the Afghanistan war at that time, had gotten very, very costly, and that came at the expense of consumer products in the Soviet Union. That ranged from food shortages, from meat to butter and cheese and that sort of stuff, all the way into the areas of regular, commercial consumer products. And there was a shortage. He said to me he cannot go and buy music CDs. They don't have any. They can't make any because all of that money was used for other things than this kind of production. He couldn't buy alpine skis, downhill skis. So I gave him my set and that sort of stuff. And it was that kind of issue they had that the Soviet Union, in the end, in 1991, then collapsed. That was the direct result out of the arms races the United States and the Soviet Union had engaged in since the Korean War, basically, 1949, which grew and grew and grew. And the same story was true here in the United States. So when I came in August of 1989 for the first time to the United States, I was staying in Midtown Manhattan at the Hilton, actually, yeah, Midtown Hilton, and I was at Times Square, and there was this gigantic clock with like 12 digits on it, and it was running and running and running and running. So I asked someone, what is this clock? And they said, this is the debt clock, the debt of the United States. This was the money the United States was spending, which they didn't have, and most of this money was, excuse me, most of this money was basically used for the military, for the arms races against the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc versus the Western Bloc. And so when 1989, when the wall came down, and especially when the Soviet Union collapsed, so to speak, Bush went on national television, Bush Sr., and he said that we have won. There wasn't really anything to win in this. The reality was the Soviet Union had gone broke before the United States did. And then a mad race developed here in the United States, and that was to strive for a balanced budget. That means there was no more deficit spending. So, and that was accomplished in the mid-90s because they had reached an armament deal, or the disarmament deal with the Soviet Union, or former Soviet Union, and the Ukraine was going to give up their nuclear missiles and all of this stuff. So we had, by like 1996, I was here in the United States, things were doing really good. People were very optimistic. We were glad, probably anywhere in the world, that this nonsense was over. And the balanced budget came about. So Newt Gingrich and Clinton then signed on it, and they finally did this. So the United States had a budget surplus for the first time since 1930s or something like this in terms of tax revenue coming in and the government spending money. That made the dollar extremely strong. So when they launched the euro in 1999-2000, the exchange rate was about €1.20 for $1. So the dollar was extremely strong, and gold was at about $280 an ounce, just so you get an idea. So almost $1,000 less from where it is today. And that was all based on this, that that America no longer had deficit spending. We had a balanced budget, and the national debt clock in New York and Times Square was retired. I think 98 when they retired it. It was gone from Times Square. It had run what they were running up in deficit spending with interest and everything else, and that clock basically was turned off. So this is the mindset we're coming from in the West, was that this was finally over. Then Bush gets elected and the Taliban comes into the picture with 9/11 and everything else. So here we go again. Here comes a massive spending on military build-up and military action and this, that, and the other thing. Now, this time not against the not against the Soviet Union or Russia, but in the Middle East, yeah, this whole thing. And then ISIS and everything else. This has cost us a lot of money. So now we're going from a balanced budget and a debt reduction in 1999-2000 to 2024, and the United States is now a whopping $32 trillion or $34 trillion in debt. And that is public debt that is accumulated out of spending which could not be covered from tax revenue coming in. That's deficit spending over 20, 30 years, basically, or 25 years, 24 years at this point. Plus the extra expenses, the war, the top money, when we had the financial crash, then you had the coronavirus, all of this stuff, plus the regular stuff, and everyone wanted money, and everyone wanted money. So we went from a balanced budget to $1 trillion in deficit spending, by far more than what we ever had. And the Soviet Union is no longer on the map in this. Neither was China a real threat during that period to begin with, since we have never really gotten rid of any of our nuclear weapons here. So this is kind of the situation. Now, the development in the Russian Federation was pretty much is kind of what Alexander had shared with me. This is what they did now. It wasn't really, I didn't quite understand it in 1988 when we talked about it, but he had this Russian conservative belief system. So this is partially from the Russian Orthodox faith, then part based of it in communism, since he was a communist. He was a member of the Communist Party. He was a full-fledged communist. Probably to this day, since he's still alive, I'm pretty sure he still is. But he was very conservative, and that struck me back then. And he was neither a Stalinist, neither a Leninist, nor a Marxist. So you couldn't put him in any of these categories. But he was some sort of a newer type communist who had an appreciation for material possessions. And that material possession thing is always something they have struggled with in communism to begin with. So he wanted material possessions. So this was part of it, why the Soviet Union was able to collapse, because the need of the society for material possessions, consumer stuff, was not satisfied. And if you don't satisfy this in a kind of a environment, a kind of a dictatorship, and that sort of, a state system, which is not based on a free market, on capitalism, where people cannot satisfy these needs or can make a decision, either I want this or I don't want it, then it becomes a turning point, say, like it could be a cause for a revolution. And that's exactly what we had. So what did they do is at first is Boris Yeltsin was highly regarded here in the United States. There's an interview Nixon gave in 1992, or was it 1993, with one of the American news channels here at that time, and he said this. And this was before Putin came into the picture working for Yeltsin. So this was in the early stages after the collapse, when Boris Yeltsin had taken over, and they were trying to sort through of which direction they're going to go. And what I thought back then they would do is kind of the direction they went. They went first with a conservative approach in this, and that is a You can't really call it a socialist conservative approach either. You know, they call them social conservatives here in the United States, maybe to a certain degree, but not quite like it. But it is based on a high moral standard, at least from the political side. That is what they're trying to sell to the public. I just watched a video with Dmitry Medvedev explaining to young Russian, audience, to young Russian audience, live audience, the border strategies of the Russian Federation today. The way he dressed, the way the audience was dressed reflected this. This is a society or a leadership which justifies its being in a moral superiority. Sometimes church people do this, when they come up, we said we're the do-gooders, we're doing better than anyone, not because financially, but as people, as, morals, ethical standards and stuff like this. So you can ask, so they have kind of that environment now, where they're basically tolerant of the church, which was oppressed before because of Stalin, the Russian Orthodox Church, but they're not directly, involved with the church, or the church is not directly involved in the state, not to the full extent. They have nothing really in common with the previous Tsaren Empire. None of the stuff is there from the Tsaristic traditions, the hierarchy, or any of that stuff. Neither in the military nor in society. And they have adopted to some form of a capitalist free market system within their own country, where goods can be traded. And I think this was the biggest revelation for the old-fashioned communists in the Eastern Bloc back then, was that the denial of sufficient amount of consumer products and food staple caused all of this upheaval. So they have gone away from all of their socialistic models and ideals they had from the October Revolution in 1917, and this Marxist stuff to quite an extent, and Lenin and Stalin as well. They have basically junked all of this stuff. However, what now happened is this, that the Ukraine shifted away from that Russian picture, out of the Russian picture. Now, I'm no expert on arguing a case for or against whether Russia or the Ukraine was always part of Russia or not. I do not want to get involved in this because that gets really detailed, and I don't have enough knowledge to exactly pinpoint this of what that actually is and what it is not. But anyway, as more as the Ukraine now in the 2000s started to look towards the European Union, towards NATO and those things, is more irritated now the Russian leadership got with this whole situation over there in the way it was developing. And Putin himself just said it in an interview about 3 days ago, or last week I think it was, where he was asked by a Russian reporter for one of the main Russian news channels of whether Biden or Trump would be better for Russia. And of course his answer was Biden is better, because they can get away with things. Biden or the Democrats are too hesitant to take any draconian measures against the Soviet Union, or Russia in this case. So they're more at liberty to do what they want to do to pursue their goals. We saw this in 2014 with Crimea, when Obama got reelected. The Crimean offensive started, and the whole Donbas region over there, this thing started to develop at that point. Two, then there was nothing while Trump was in office, because they were worried that Trump is such a lunatic that he would push the buttons and they're going to have the nuclear missiles from the United States raining onto the, Russian Federation, which could be possible. Who knows what Trump is going to do. But this is kind of how this is all interrelated. So now we're at this point. They have built up, with Western help, the economy since 1991. They have developed entrepreneurial skills. They have adopted a fairly free market system in the Russian Federation. And they have developed a central bank system similar to what we have in the West, which means the government now, the Duma, can print money at their disposal and use this to do defense spending. And that's exactly what they're doing. And that money now they have been spending on wartime production with, which goes into several different channels, have increased the food prices in there. This is a direct relation with the increased activity. That in turn has lowered the value of the ruble because you got more ruble now in circulation. So one leads to the other, and it won't really stop for the Russian Federation until the war is going to come to an end and the Russian government is going to stop spending or printing money and getting that money out into the economy that way. Because people are getting paid, they're working overtime, they're hiring more people in these defense facilities to build the stuff, transportation. These tanks need to be transported, and then it goes on. So this kind of explains on how they got into this mess, so to speak, with the inflation, which the Russians are not used to, because before it was pretty kept low, because they didn't want this either in Russia. And now they have it because of the war. So that is a side effect of the direct war activity Putin and the Duma collectively is orchestrating over there. Now, the last reports I got today was from Austria, from our friend from the Austrian military. And he said that the Russians have now 500,000 soldiers stationed in the Donbas region, or in that conflict region over there to begin with, and that the British military secret service estimates that about 1,000 soldiers, Russian soldiers, are getting killed in this offensive they're orchestrating. We had an offensive. They always do this in the winter because everything is frozen. That makes it easier to move. Once the spring is going to get here, everything is going to turn into mud paddles over there, and they won't be able to do any advances. But like I said before in my other videos, this is a meat grinder, and no side has really taken a full advantage of the other side. And how much ammunition the Ukrainians have, I cannot say for sure. I'm pretty sure that they're hurting for money because the US is the main supporter in this. But I don't think we will see a clear or decisive victory in this, because the advances, now the Russians advance into the Ukrainian trenches, which are heavily mined, and but there is a lack on the Ukrainian side of artillery, and that is a big obstacle, which means it may make it easier for the Russians to break through on certain spots until the Ukrainians can replenish the artillery in that area. And that we need to see on how this is going to be accomplished. Now, back to Germany's role in there, in this entire scandal they got now, with the Bundeswehr general, Air Force general, was using an unsecured phone line while he was in Singapore joining a conference. Now, let me tell you one thing. Is back in the days during the Cold War, when I was involved with the NATO over there, I traveled to the supreme headquarters of the Allied Pact in Europe, in Mons, which is in Belgium, outside of Brussels. And this whole area, this whole building structure for the NATO there, that's the military headquarters, is first of all outside, so you can see outside the city limits. This was basically out in the green fields, where you could see any type of vehicle miles away, basically coming to it. For one is, and the entire thing was had a substructure, the subterranean bunker structure underneath it, which it still does probably today, where they had secure meeting rooms and everything else. If the NATO military had to conduct conversations like this, discussions, in this case, they would have met at that facility because that was considered the most secure facility. And this is what I'm seeing, and what I have been saying is since 1991, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the West was so relieved, and I'm sure that the people in Russia were also relieved, that the nuclear threat, the Cold War, was over. So that didn't mean necessarily that the, espionage activities and eavesdropping and all of this would cease. But the threat directly of having a nuclear confrontation or nuclear war was first of all off the table. And now we're seeing we have gotten too lax in the way we're conducting our business here, or at least Germany. Germany had shifted to pacifism in the 1970s. That kind of came out of the movement there, the anti-Vietnam War group, and then it grew with the stationing of Pershing missiles. Those were the mid-range missiles from Germany into the Soviet Union, which had a shorter flight duration. That posed a tremendous threat to the Russians itself back then in the late 70s, early 80s, when the Americans stationed these Pershings. But they were in a direct response to the SS-20 missiles, which would come into Europe from the Soviet or Ukrainian territory in that case. So this was like the counterbalance, and there were peace protests, and the churches got involved, and we had the Easter marches, and we had the candlelight things, and people would hold hands. They formed these long chains. And so Germany had really adopted, so did East Germany, into a pacifist society. So today, the result out of this is we have no more compulsory military service, which we did have back then. And so that was abolished in 2010 because the Soviet Union was not looked at as a threat, or Russia, that these things would re-emerge. But it did, as we learned in 2014. And there were people who cautioned Germany about this, especially here from the United States, who were not as optimistic by 2010 or 2008 already with Russia and Putin especially, that this was looked at. I was always a little bit worried about Putin because of his background with the KGB, and he lived in Dresden, as you probably know, as a KGB officer, so he conducted some espionage activity there. I don't know exactly what unit he belonged to, but he was fully involved in it. And he speaks fluent German, of course, because of this. And so there was always that cloud hanging over it. And then the timing of when Boris Yeltsin brought Putin into his administration, which was like in 97, somewhere between 97 and 99, when he first came into existence in the then Russian Federation political scene, ruling party system, basically. That was the timing of it. The events would happen here in the United States. What probably shocked the Russian government was because they're based from their belief system on moral superiority. As leaders, sometimes the West like to point at their shortcomings, but in general, you probably won't find very many, because if it does have shortcomings, then they're covered up. But mostly these people are that righteous, so to speak. That time was when Monica Lewinsky and this whole story over here unfolded, with the Republicans pushing more and more into that direction of, now, like I said this before, is we kind of went through this transition where we didn't have to spend in the United States any more money, large monies on military defense spending and arms races and stuff like this. So now the unity among politicians was not as required, and that was the start of what we're seeing now here, with everything being so divided between the Republicans and Democrats. That wasn't in existence. That started to fall apart after 91, because now the Republicans said, we can pursue now our Republican agenda, religious part, anti-abortion, and this, that, and the other thing, and you name it. One of these people out of the Republican Party, I forgot now who that was, said that after 91, when everything collapsed over there, he said the Russian Orthodox Church is going to save American Christianity, because that was basically the explanation, was the Russian Orthodox Church had basically collapsed on purpose, the Soviet Union, and that enabled now the religious right here, to pursue their goals, which accumulated now last year in the end of Roe versus Wade, with abortions and everything else, what is following now, what you're seeing here. This has been like now 20, 30 years in the making here as well. All of this is interrelated. And this is how interesting this actually is. So now we have the divided Congress. We have no money for the Ukraine, because there is Republicans, especially the staunch Republicans out of the conservative right movement, religious right movement, which thinks they owe something to the Russian Church, to the Orthodox Church. Then you have the other part of the Republicans here, which are opposing the spending of money, tax money, or getting further into debt on costs of the U.S. population of the country. There's also Democrats who agree with that, because they want to rather spend this money here in the United States, either not spend it at all, or spend it here in the United States rather than for other causes where they may never get it back. So this is kind of how this all interrelates. And then you had Bill Clinton with Monica Lewinsky, and the whole moral thing is the Republicans said this wasn't because he had a sexual affair with Monica Lewinsky, but he lied about the sexual affair. If he would have admitted to the sexual affair, then the Republicans would have basically stoned him to death, because he had a sexual relation with a subordinate. And that kind of shocked the people like Boris Yeltsin, which the West always liked to portray as the Russian drunk who was out of his mind on vodka. If you listen to the interview with Nixon, who had talked to Boris Yeltsin shortly after that, before he became president, he had a contact with him, you will get a very different picture of Boris Yeltsin and what actually ensued over there, and how this actually influenced the political elite here within the Republican Party. That is the most interesting thing in this. So all of this is interrelated, and I cannot predict the future, but if you were confused about, or if you are confused about our times we live in, and why this all has transpired, especially if you were born after the year 2000, if you're one of the younger viewers, really it doesn't matter what part of the world you are, because you probably have experienced some effects on all of this stuff here, what's going on in the United States and what's going on over in the Ukraine and in Russia. Whether you live directly in these countries or in other countries around it, you will have noticed and experienced some changes, some impacts. These things have had an impact on your life. And I hope that this video may have brought some more clarity to you on how this interrelates, where we are militarily. Like I said this before, this is a trench war. So don't be too fooled if they break through on one part of the trench systems and they go somewhat into Ukraine. They're going to get stopped sooner than later, because these trenches are pretty deep and there's only so far you can go until you have bled out of men, until they're replenished, and by that time the other side is going to replenish. And I'm pretty sure the Ukrainians are pretty clever people, so they're going to come up with some ways trying to defend their country and their front lines. We will see on how this is going to develop. I'm going to check in probably in another couple months, 3 months. I thought I wanted to say something about the Trump deal in the end and the Republican primaries we had. I don't want to sit here and say I told you so, but what I had mentioned in all my previous videos about Trump, the deification of Trump and so far and so on, is now materializing. The only thing what the Democrats have accomplished with all of the indictments and all of the circus what they have put him through is that they have basically vilified him, and they have made him a symbol to a whole group of people, and this is a pretty large segment of the population here. How that election is going to go at the end of the year, that is going to be seen. We will see after the primary party conventions. I think they're like in July, August, somewhere around there, especially the Republican one. Then we will have probably some more clarity in which direction this is going. I probably will check in before this. I don't think we will see a spring offensive from the Ukraine this year. If we do, that means that they were able to rearm without additional money from Congress, which is possible if they got surplus military stuff from all sorts of military sources around the globe and other military forces, then they might be able to just pull that off and no one knows anything about it. That is always a possibility. You cannot rule that out. But I think I'm going to check in at that point. I hope you had some clarity, or it gave you some clarity. You may understand a couple things more now. I hope so, at least. If you don't, well, I don't know what to tell you. With that, you have a good night.